Hey guys, I'm going to walk you through my process for drawing this bird from observation. So when we talk about observational drawing, it's when we're looking at something in either real life or from a photo. But the most important part is the observing, the careful looking. So I wanted to really show you my process of how I did this. Because I think that sometimes when I do an example, students will look at it and say, oh, well, of course hers came out good. She's an art teacher or she's an adult. But I wanted you to see the many times that I had to change things and edit things and go back after looking more carefully so that you could kind of see that that's what artists just do and that you can do the same thing to make your work really look realistic. So the first thing is when we're trying to draw things realistically, we always want to work with either a life image or a reference photo. So this is my reference photo. Um, and the first thing I want to do when I have my paper, after I look at what the orientation of the photo or image is, so whether it would be a long and tall composition or a short and wide one, then I want to start blocking shapes. This is so important. So many times I see students draw part of the drawing, like for example, they would do a beautiful job drawing the head, only to realize that it was way too small and now there was all this empty space on the page, or they drew it too big and now they ran out of space for the whole bottom of the bird. So taking some time just to not only recognize the basic shapes within the image or drawing, but also the size of them on the page is very important. Now, for the love of all that is good, please draw these shapes lightly. Draw light. Because a big part of why students struggle when they're doing an observational drawing is that they have drawn too hard, and then when they try to edit and make changes, it's very frustrating when they've drawn something hard and now they have all these eraser marks and everywhere, and it's much easier, and you'll do yourself a big favor if you are drawing lightly. Now, I honestly wish that I had taken a picture the first time, but the first time that I drew these circles and square kind of shapes on the page, I drew them too big. So I had to go in and erase them. And I'm so glad that I did because I had to redraw them. So once I'm happy with the size of them compared to my reference photo and the space they take up on the page, then I can go back in and start adding a little bit more detail. As you can see here, I just started to block out the shapes of the beak and the feet and the branch. Then the next thing that I would want to do is start to just look more carefully and add a little bit more detail, but constantly editing and after looking back at my reference picture. Now, by editing, I mean sometimes you look back, like here, I noticed at the top of the head that I made it way too high, so I decided I was going to make it shorter. And then I realized I made the wing come out too much, so I erased it and brought it in. And then I began to add some texture, and I changed the shape of the beak a bit, added some extra textures to the toes. Then before I went to do the eye, I wanted to sort of measure the proportions or sizes of the eye and beak in comparison to each other. So I could see kind of by measuring that the width of the eye was about a little bit more than half the length of the beak. So that really helped me to make sure that I drew my eye the correct size. Once I was happy with that, I began to sketch the outline of some leaves in the background that I saw in the reference photo. I didn't make them exactly like the picture, but I made them pretty close. Then I began to use my oil pastel. So I started by adding textured light blue to the belly and the same thing to the head, and did some very light blending. Then I looked back at my reference photo and noticed that some areas of the feathers were darker, and this also defined the shape, so I added a dark blue. And I looked carefully at the feet and noticed that they even had some lines on them that looked almost blue as well. Then when I went to do the bird's little under chin area, I didn't have a purple that was just the right color, so I decided that I was going to blend red and violet together. I began with the red, blended it in, then colored over with the purple and blended that. But then I realized it was a little too red, so I decided to go back over it with more purple. Once I was satisfied with the color, I began to add other um, colors to it that I saw in the picture that sort of enhanced the feather texture. And same with the white to do the same thing. Now, black oil pastel is a big no-no until the very, very end because it can be a super smudgy, messy disaster. If you use too much of it, it can really like just smudge up your whole picture. But in this case, I chose to use it very sparingly, so just a tiny bit on the under chin and then blended it lightly and went back over it with some purple. But again, if you're going to use black, please be very careful, and when in doubt, wait till the end. Then I began to work on my background a little bit. So even though my bird wasn't finished, because I needed black to finish everything, I moved on to another section. I began to color the leaves in with just a basic green. And if you notice, I sort of outlined the shapes and then colored them in. This prevented me from having sort of scribbly looking edges. Once I had all the basic green blocked in, I looked for subtle or not so noticeable differences in the colors of the leaves. So I took colors like gold and gray and light green, and in different areas blended them, colored them in like on top of the green, and then gently blended them in. And in some areas I even over blended, so then I went back over with a green. So you could see here I used gray to tone down some of them, yellow to brighten some areas up. And then I began to work on the branches. And I noticed while working on the branches that the color wasn't right. So I looked more carefully at my reference photo and noticed that the branch was actually more like a gray than a brown. So I added some brown. And then upon looking at the background of my reference photo, I noticed that there were definitely some leaves there, but they were out of focus and kind of blurry. I thought this would add a nice effect because it would look like they were far off in the distance and allow the bird and the leaves that were close to be a focal point. So I very, very lightly blocked in some leaf-like shapes and vine-like shapes, and then took some of those colors that I had added to the leaves before and added them over those shapes throughout. And then I began to blend those colors together. Once I was happy with how the background was blended, I felt confident to start with the black. So I began small areas first by adding the black texture. Then I went over it with the blue, but then my blue got kind of dirty. So I decided to clean it with a paper towel and it looked good as new. Then I added some dark blue in with my texture and blended it again. And then I added some black. Then I began to do the dark black feathers on the shoulder and the beak. And I also noticed on the beak that it wasn't solid black. There were areas closer to the face where it was more brown, so I added that as well. After adding the black and blending a little bit, I decided that I wanted to add some light highlights after looking carefully at the reference photo and seeing little dots on there, and also a little highlight along the bottom of the beak. Then I began to color the eyes, and I colored them lightly and then blended. I definitely didn't want to overdo it because I knew it would smudge all over the nice light blue of the bird. Then I added some gray and white for highlights. And then I noticed that the eye was actually too narrow, so I added more black to make it a little rounder. Then I went back in and added more color and texture to the feet, and again some black. And I added some shadows in between the toes.
Good afternoon.
Now I finally felt like I was ready to start coloring the tail, which was probably the largest area that I would have to use all black oil pastel. before. So I started by outlining it so that I wouldn't have smudgy edges. And then I began to color inside of it. But I colored very lightly first because remember, you can always add more later, but if you put too much oil pastel on, it can get really smudgy. Then I blended it, starting with the edges first. And I sort of used my finger to outline, like sort of follow the outline of the tail so I wouldn't smudge out of the lines. And then I had it all blended. But when I look back, I thought it should be a little bit darker black, so I added more and blended that as well. Then, after holding it back and looking at it, I realized the belly was a little too light, so I went in and added more feather texture. And I did that with light blue and dark blue. And then I held it back, and you could see that because you could see my ugly 90s couch and a bunch of toys on the living room floor.